I'll call this meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Authority to order and ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Vice Chair Craven?
Here.
Director Nahman?
Here.
Director Bennett?
Here.
Director Borger?
Here.
Okay. Director Nauman, could you lead us in the pledge, please?
Absolutely.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, are there any amendments to the agenda or agenda review?
Yes, Chair Craven. Staff's recommending that item number 7 be continued to next month. It's not quite ready for prime time.
Okay, is there any objection? Okay, so ordered. That's it?
That's it?
One more.
I'm sorry. One other thing. We would like to suggest that item number 4 be moved up to informational above item number 2.
Okay. Above number 2.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anything else?
That's it. Sorry.
Okay. Public comments. This is the time the board hears from members of the public on items that are not on the agenda. I don't have any cards, but is there anybody who'd like to speak to us? I see someone coming forward.
Do I need to fill out a card? Okay. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. Reddy Pakala with County Public Works Agency. I just want to share some good news. As you know, County has been working on LDO septic tank prohibition for some time now. We completed the last phase of that LDO septic tank conversion this month. And I know GMA was very much interested in this project. And actually, you gave us seed money of $5,000 back to year 2000. That really started us to do the income survey for this community, and we were able to go after grants, and we were able to get 75% grants for this project, and the 25% of the money came from 30-year loan with 1% interest. What it means, a good thing for United, Oxnard, and the county, we are able to take out as much as 200,000 pounds of nitrates on a yearly basis by abandoning the septic systems.
Thank you. So it's all done.
All the construction is completed, yes.
Okay, wonderful. I was on the Regional Water Board when that tough decision was made. It was the last day I was on the board, and it's taken a long time. That was, what, the year 2000? I think so. No, 1999, December of 1999. So.
I'd just like to compliment Reddy and hope you feel a real sense of satisfaction.
Yeah.
I mean, when you can pull a project like that off, everybody benefits by.
That's right.
By, getting all of El Rio, off of septic and onto sewers. So that's the one thing about you engineers. You get to actually see some concrete things every now and then, and that's got to be pretty satisfying.
Yes, Director Bennett, I do feel satisfied. It was a great project. It was a long time coming. It took us 11 years to get here, but I had a good support from our Board of Supervisors. I was telling them one time, I have gone in front of them about 44 times about this project.
But thank you. You did a great job with it.
And Madam Chair, I just want to note there's another member of our GMA family that was also involved. Our own Rick Ricoots was involved with that when he was in his previous career. He worked on that. So.
Well, congratulations to everybody who worked on it for so long. Sometimes government works slowly and for a lot of reasons, but that was a good thing to happen. Okay, board member comment. Is there anybody else who'd like to? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Dale Zarowski, representing the Farm Bureau and Ventura County Agricultural Irrigated Lands Group, and I have some good news today. We had the regional board administered a fine to one of the farmers in the GMA who had refused to follow the conditional waiver and join VCALG, and they gave out an administrative fine of $194,000 at their last meeting, which we welcome in that a lot of farmers have joined VCALG and are adhering to the conditional waiver. So good news for the enforcement effort on getting people to join VCALG. Thank you.
Good news day.
Yeah, anything else? We'll take all the good news we can. No, okay. Board member comments? Okay.
Try to help the pace a bit.
Approval of minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the meeting of February 23rd?
So moved to approve the minutes as submitted.
Motion and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Doesn't sound like there's any opposition. Motion carries unanimously. Okay, information items. We're moving number 4 up. Coastal saline intrusion update, please.
Yes, for the record, Brian Bondi with United and the GMA. Good afternoon, directors. Item 4 is really a follow-up. In January, I presented an update on our groundwater levels and water quality in the agency, and also talked about the basin management objectives. And at that time, I indicated that we had hoped to have Mr. Tony Morgan, groundwater department manager at United, present about updates of a recent geophysical study to study the extent of saline intrusion into our aquifers along the coast. And he wasn't available at the time, so we've asked him to come today and give that presentation. So I'd like to introduce Tony Morgan.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Tony Morgan with United Water. Today we're going to give you a presentation on the update to the saline water intrusion along the South Oxnard Plain. Let's go over a quick overview of some of the concepts here that we need to be straight with as we get started. Here's sort of a cartoon drawing of the Oxnard Plain, and we've got, let's call it Santa Clara River right here, Freeman Diversion there delivering out to the PTP, PV systems and that kind of thing. And of most importance here is this schematic of the aquifers. So there's an upper system here and a lower system here marked by the sort of beige color, I guess it is there, and the green. But what we want to point out here is that there's seawater intrusion marked by this sort of pinkish purplish colors here that intrudes along the coastline where these aquifers come in contact with the seafloor. So as we pump here, we induce a gradient that pulls that seawater inland. Okay? So these are the kinds of things that we have to address if we're going to come to some understanding of how we're going to control this in the future, and basically to understand where we're at this point in time. There's a lot of spatial variability in it, so it's not the same. In other words, that seawater front doesn't move in an equal distance all along the coastline. In addition, we also have a temporal variation. So this graph gives you just one example of what we see out there. For example, at this depth, we see chloride concentrations of 68 back in 1990, 36 in 2009, but in between that roughly 19-20 year period, it's been as high as 350. So we see that there's also time-based variability in the chloride contents along the coast. So no longer does it vary just with time, but also over space as well. Okay, back in the early 90s, the U.S. Geological Survey did a geophysical survey out there to try to map out what the extent of the salinity was along the coast. It had not been reviewed for that 20-year or so period, and United embarked on a program to reevaluate that using a geophysical technique called time domain electromagnetics. It's not necessary to go into the physics of it, but basically the approach is to gather electromagnetic data based on wire loops that are laid out in the ground. You model that, and from that you can infer what the subsurface conditions are like throughout the basin. Historically, we've depicted the upper aquifer system salinities as two lobes, sort of one originating over in the Hueneme area, okay, the other originating in the Mugu area. And this was based largely upon the red dots you see here are piezometers, where we have depth-specific water samples that we can gain control over that depth function on the salinity. So we have two lobes, okay, separated. That's Hueneme Road there, just to give you some geographic reference points on it, and there's the one. So you see largely south of Hueneme. Now, When we did the geophysical survey, we didn't rely on just a dozen or so data points. We had many more data points as you see depicted here. And we contoured out the apparent resistivities and inferred the salinity in the aquifers. And we're going to give you a snapshot look at 4 different depth intervals so you can see what happens as we go down in the aquifer. So once again, Wanini Road right along here. Okay. The blue area right here, the bright blue area, are saline water. Okay, that's usually inferred by greater than 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS. So definitely impacted by seawater. The sort of bluish turquoise tinted area here is brackish water, so that's maybe 1,000 to 10,000 TDS, something in that range.
At what depth are we talking about here?
This right here is probably in the 150 to 250 foot depth. Okay. The key here that we're looking at is we've got a larger area with some brackish water that's inferred from the geophysical data, much larger than what we've previously assumed. Okay. The gray areas here are brackish to background, and then the brown tan areas here are basically background concentrations. The area over here in Wanini, we wanted to extend the survey out over here to catch where the historical representations of the plumes are at, but there's just too much urbanization there to get good quality data. Okay, here's the historical representation. So you can see it's similar in some respects, you know, the big blob down here at the Magoo and something over here in the Wanini area, but basically we're seeing that it's connected. The 2 lobes have connected themselves, and there's a much larger inland extent of the brackish waters.
Since when?
This was last looked at in, the USGS did it in the early 90s. Okay? And again, the reason we see the difference in this representation versus the colored representation you see here in the background is we have 2 different kinds of data. This is based on water samples from a limited number of wells. We don't have water wells everywhere we want them. Okay? So we use what you have and you infer aerial distributions based on that. This we had many more data points, to the order of 150-ish data points. Okay. If we look a little bit deeper, okay, we see a similar pattern, saline water along the coast, but now we've got some distinct fingers and lobes coming in, not quite as far inland as previous map that you saw, but nonetheless a similarly defined picture here. There's a historic for comparison. And again, the water wells there map out the saline distribution for all of the upper aquifer system, and we've taken it and divided it into 2 parts, so of an upper and a lower. Yeah.
Tony, your previous slide on the upper aquifer, the previous dotted lines look the same, or I thought they were a little bit different. Is that?
You mean those lines there?
Yes.
Yes, that's the historical representation. So I wanted to take you back to the way we've classically done the presentations on the aerial extent of the salinity, so you could just see them for comparison purposes.
So
they're
the
the
upper and the lower, the 2 distinct areas where we assume they were in the same zones?
These are both the upper system now. So this is the lower part of the upper system.
I got you.
Okay, so we had an upper and a lower map. Okay?
Understood. Thank you.
Okay. Then in the lower system, we have 2 lobes, not quite as large out of the Wanini area, similar size down in the Magoo area, and once again, based on the red dots you see out here. I didn't point out before, the blue dots that you see on the map represent production wells that exist in the area that we don't necessarily have water quality data on, but there are a significant number of them out there. Okay, here's our lower system data points. Now, if we look at the area from 500 to 800 feet below ground, we see a similar distribution. We've got blue colors here along the coast, but we've got kind of a donut-shaped area here. Okay, so the brackish water wrapping around. We've got the hint of the Wanimi plume coming in there, and historically we've stopped it somewhere around here, but the data suggests that the nose of it may be somewhere out in this area. Okay. Similar, but actually extending around and being a little more extensive to the west and north of the Magoo area. Let's go down a little bit deeper, 800 to 1,200 feet. Similar pattern, we've lost a piece of the donut over here on this side, okay, but very similar pattern to the upper part of the lower aquifer system. Okay, and there's your historical comparison. Now, summarizing this quickly, as you've heard before in Brian's summaries and various reports that have been put out by United and others, we're not really meeting the basin management objectives for water levels out on the Oxnard Plain to enable us to battle the saline water intrusion. Okay? Most of our levels are quite a bit below where they need to be. Okay? We're learning and gaining more data all the time about how variable the distribution is vertically and horizontally out there. And if we're going to attack this problem down the road, we need to understand what that variability is. We've got some future work going on. These are phase 2s and 3s of this evaluation. We're going to be flow profiling some of those existing production wells that we think are kind of on the leading edge of the plume and see if we can find that leading edge and refine its location out there a little bit more accurately. And we've also got a project to construct a pilot injection well there along Wanimi Road, just a little bit west of Rice in the near future. We're going to need lots of data if we're going to design a barrier well field in the future. All this brings up a number of management considerations that exist with the situation. It's not an immediate crisis. We're not worried about day to day that it's moved an extra 4 inches today because something didn't happen to gain it under control. But on the other side of the coin, it's not something that we necessarily want to let go another 20 years before we begin to address it either. Okay? Any solutions we come about with are going to have to consider a lot of variables. What's the actual intent of controlling the seawater? Do we want to call what's already intruded sacrificial and put a barrier and just prevent any further migration? Or do we do a reclamation program where we actually want to try to flush the aquifer and bring it back to a more drinking water standard, or at least a more usable standard for irrigation purposes? Those two are very different types of programs that you might want to embark on. All of these choices are going to have long lead times, and they're going to have a significant commitment of resources. Those resources will be dollars, capital dollars to build infrastructure, well fields, pipelines, that kind of thing. But it's also going to need water. So if we're going to have water to put in an injection well field, where is that water going to come from? There's been talk of using water from the GREAT program to possibly put in the injection well fields. That's one use for it. Or we could do in-lieu delivery out there and help mitigate the lowered heads in the aquifers by decreasing the pumping. That's another alternative. If we go the barrier well field route, then we're going to have to take a look at if we're injecting wells or injecting water in wells along, let's just say, for example, Wanimi Road. It sort of defeats the purpose to have injection in there and a quarter-mile away have someone pulling that same water back out of the ground. So there's some management decisions and thoughts that have to go into all of this. And I just bring those up today so that the board can begin to think about those and wonder how the best approach is. Any questions?
Yeah, I got a couple, Tony.
Surely.
In those areas out there, I don't know what the number would be, but a lot of those shallower wells drilled many years ago were you're in both the upper Magoo and the Oxnard aquifer. So
yes,
you've got, even though you're analyzing two different zones, you've got wells out there pulling from both areas.
That's correct. That's correct. And the next phase of our evaluation of this data is we're trying to refine the depth. So we're going back in and, for example, going at 100-foot spacings on the depth and trying to map out what the salinity is on a much finer scale using the same data. So we're trying to account for those so we can see them.
Because in one theory, you've got cascading water from one zone to the next, actually, when they're not pumping as well.
That is correct. When we have wells perforated in multiple aquifers, we always have the opportunity for things to move back and forth, for one zone to go up or to go down, depending on the heads that you see.
Okay, and on your maps, where we have the PTP system, and then further east, you have the Pleasant Valley Water Pipeline Delivery System.
Yes.
We don't have any data that can show, since we put that in, if that's changed some of the pumping patterns, as far as the water movement, seawater movement?
No. We don't have enough data out in the Pleasant Valley area for that. There's also the issue of whether or not all of the salinity that we see in some of the wells out in the Pleasant Valley area is actually seawater. Okay? There are geochemical data that suggests that some of that is oil field brines or connate waters that were in the marine sediments when they were laid down, and now they're being released as we're depressing the heads. We're lowering the water levels in those aquifers, and those salts are coming off into solution into the aquifers. So there's a couple of three things going on there as we move away from the coast that we need to decipher if we're going to totally address salinity in the aquifers. Today's presentation was focused mostly along the coast.
Because, in 05 and 06, I think, and Dr. Bachman, you can correct me, but we had artesian conditions when we had a lot of percolation through the spreading grounds.
Mm-hmm.
So with that and the pipeline delivery system, where we're doing surface deliveries, anytime we can get people off the wells and do surface diversions or other water supplies, that helps a lot also.
I'm 100% in agreement with that. If we can have in-lieu deliveries and get people off of pumping, give them surface water or other waters that we can route to them, that's a good thing.
Question? You find injection, do you find saltwater intrusion anyplace else in Ventura County on the Fox Canyon Aquifer? Or is this?
These are the primary areas.
Okay.
Yeah, these are the primary areas. And they're related to the offshore canyons there. If you saw on the one map, there were sort of the tight little contour lines there. Those represent the two submarine canyons there where the aquifers come and daylight into the ocean there.
Right. And then just to follow up the questions, I just want to be clear. You talked about various things that we could do, create a barrier, et cetera, but there's no question if we overdraft, we increase the problem.
Correct.
Thank you.
On your barrier wells, what conflict do you come into at all with domestics, or are there any existing in that area?
It depends on what we're going to use for injection.
Right.
If we're using potable water, then it's less of an issue. If we're using recycled water, then there are standoffs that are mandated by the Department of Public Health for those.
And what distance is that?
It's, is it 1,200 feet or is it 2,500 feet? Well, that's true. It depends on how you evaluate it. The more detailed and scientific your approach is, the shorter that distance can be. But if you do just back of the envelope calculations, it's a rather long distance.
And if this was a pre-Columbian period, where would that interface be? Would it be at the ocean floor or back? Is there any tidal influence that occurs naturally, or is this all induced?
There is. There is a tidal influence on it.
So how far back might you say, 100 yards, 1,000 feet, would have been the tidal influence in a historical
in a
time?
pre-heavy urbanization, pre-pumping
before Columbus
scenario,
sailed.
I doubt that you're talking more than a few hundred feet inland.
Okay. And the maximum here is now probably about a mile?
Something to that effect, yes.
Any other questions? Thank you
Okay,
very much.
thank you.
Very informative.
The recommendation to receive and file.
Is there a motion to receive and file? Oh,
I just wanted to clear that up. There used to be, before development, there were some pretty high heads here, and I would be surprised if there was any intrusion coming into those at all, because there was a net discharge offshore. I'm sure you've heard the stories, that you could, when the wells were first drilled, their water would go up, 3 stories high naturally, So I think that head probably would keep even tidal effects away.
okay. Is there a motion to receive and file?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second to receive and file. Any objection? Motion carries unanimously. Okay, item number 2, Las Posas Basin-Specific Groundwater Management Plan status.
Thank you. Again, for the record, Brian Bondi with United Water and the GMA. I'm going to sort of handle items 2 and 3 sequentially. They're related in terms of item 2 being an update on the progress on the basin management plan, and item 3 being a request from the Las Posas Users Group to extend Emergency Ordinance D. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the update to provide your board with a better understanding of what has transpired in the last several months with the users group in terms of the progress on the plan so that you have a proper amount of information to consider the requested extension. My staff report covers activities in February. My oral report will also cover activities completed in March. This schematic is just a very simple diagram that kind of shows a roadmap for what we're trying to do in terms of developing the basin plan, and it also outlines some of the things that we've accomplished. The first thing that we've worked on is developing a set of goals and objectives for the plan. We want to know what we're trying to accomplish, and specifically with specific objectives in different areas. Those areas are shown here diagrammatically. We've talked about managing the West Las Posas Basin perhaps differently than the East and South Las Posas Basins because the issues are different and the solutions are potentially different. So for each area, we're going to have a set of management strategies, monitoring program, and potentially an adaptive management scheme for reacting to changes in the basin. We're going to pull both of those areas together in the plan, probably develop some sort of local advisory committee, which may be nothing more than the existing users group, which will be responsible for reviewing basin conditions and reporting and interfacing with the GMA. Where we're at in terms of the planning process, as of this morning, we've completed the goals and objectives, and we've defined what these different management areas are going to be. In the weeks and months to come, we're going to dive into the management strategies, which is the heart of the plan. Back in January, the users group approved a schedule, a project plan and a schedule for working on the basin plan. I showed you a version of this at the January GMA board meeting. What you're looking at here is time going down in terms of each month. We've outlined a set of things that we're working on. We have 4 parallel path tracks that we're working on. We're working on assumptions, technical elements, management elements, and other, basically a catch-all for everything under here. The key point of the schedule for you to see here is that we've identified some milestones, and those are in bold, caps, underlined. And you'll see here some check marks next to those different milestones here for January, February, and March. So we've been moving along with the schedule so far. We're pretty much in line with what we laid out for ourselves to accomplish. Again, we approved this project schedule in January. We developed our goals and objectives and finalized a draft of those in February. And then just in the last 2 meetings here in March, we've finalized our set of assumptions for the plan and defined our basin management areas and sub-areas.
Could you go back to the schedule, please?
Sure.
I just want to confirm that I'm reading that right. That's June of 2011?
At the bottom row, yes.
That's when you anticipate all these tasks being completed?
This is, no, this is just page 1. Here's the rest of the schedule.
That's what I was afraid you were going to say.
Right. We're anticipating coming to the board, if everything goes as planned, coming to the board and doing a presentation in October. And what we hope to have at that point is a basin plan draft that the users group has approved. Just real quickly, a little bit of information on the goals and objectives. There were 2 goals that the group agreed should be guiding principles for the plan. One is just basically a simple statement that the goal is to maintain a reliable supply of groundwater of adequate quality for the different needs of the pumpers in the basin, and we're going to achieve that by implementing the most cost-effective and equitable solutions available. And then there's a number of objectives, which I won't go through, that further detail out what that high-level goal means for the basins and the sub-basins. The second goal discusses this concept of maintaining local control over groundwater management here in Ventura County and in the basin, and that the decisions should have facilitate local cooperation, and we add some meat to the bones on that in terms of the 5 objectives under that goal. So these have been reviewed and approved by the group, and this is going to guide the overall planning process. We also had to deal with some assumptions that needed to be made for the basin plan. There's a number of things that are out in the future that obviously we're not going to have decisions on or all the information about. The 4 key things that the group has been dealing with is the future operations of Callegas Municipal Water District's Aquifer Storage and Recovery Project, the fate and utilization of any non-native water inflows from Simi Valley and Moore Park. Those are a big part of the water budget for the basin. This is a key, very key part of the plan. The schedule, construction schedule and costs for bringing the brine line up into the salinity management pipeline, also known as the brine line, up into the basin. When's it going to be there? What are the costs? We've put together some estimates on that for folks to have available as we talk about solutions. Same thing with the desalter projects. When are they going to be built? Where? What's the yield? What's the schedule? In terms of the management areas, we actually just finished this morning. What the group has elected to do is establish an overall management area, or define the area for the basin plan. That's this outer black line. Basically, it follows the stated jurisdictional authority of the agency out in this area. And then down here, it starts to follow basin boundaries. And here it's following the Springville Fault Zone, which is a known groundwater barrier between the Pleasant Valley Basin and the Camarillo Hills. The plan in terms of management is going to only extend as far west as the boundary between Cayugas Municipal Water District and United. The reason for that is that the pumpers in this area are already paying assessments to United for groundwater projects that benefit and influence this area. So they made a recommendation. Del Norte Water Company felt that it was appropriate not to have the management plan cover this part of the basin. Now, that's not to say that this area won't be monitored. We'll probably have an overall monitoring program for this area because it is hydraulically connected with the rest of the basin. It's within the area. It's just that the management approaches will not address this area in red. In terms of management within the overall plan area, we have the West Las Posas Basin, which will be a sub-management area, and we have the East and South Las Posas Basins, which will be another area. Within here, we're going to manage the shallow aquifer system along the Arroyo, separately from the deeper confined aquifer system in the rest of the basin. So back to the schedule again, I just want to point out we so far are tracking along with our stated goals and milestones. We're checking them off as we go, and that brings you up to date on the progress of the management plan. So unless there's any questions, I forward the recommendation to receive and file.
Questions?
This is just for item 2.
Just for item 2.
Okay, no questions. Motion to receive and file?
So moved.
There's a motion and a second. Any objection? So ordered.
Okay. Item 3 is a request to extend Emergency Ordinance D. As you're probably well aware, the idea behind Emergency Ordinance D is to create a timeout during which this planning process can be completed. And we've had several extensions of this Ordinance D over the past couple years, and we're bringing forward another request by the users group to extend Emergency Ordinance D. The recommendation is to adopt Revision 4 of Emergency Ordinance D, which would extend it through an unspecified time. We've left the date unspecified pending discussion with the stakeholders as well as board discussion, and there's reasons for that, which I'll explain in a moment. Rewinding a little bit, when this ordinance was last extended in December, the board, or at least some of the board members, felt that a couple things were going to be needed to be presented before this is extended again. Those two items were updated findings and a demonstrated progress of moving the basin planning process forward, which hopefully the last item covered. To address the request for additional findings, again, the idea here was we wanted to document the continued worsening conditions in the basin. What's the emergency? Why are we continuing to extend this? And there are really three things that the users group felt are continuing and are worth noting here. There's been an approximate 100-foot decline in water levels in the central part of the East Las Posas Basin associated with operations of the Aquifer Storage and Recovery Program, as well as pumping by Waterworks District Number 1, which has resumed after the in-lieu program that extended through the 90s and early part of last decade came to an end in 2007. We also have recent data, and when I say recent, we're talking the latter part of 2010. These data are showing that the migration of the saline water from the Arroyo Las Posas is continuing to move further into the central part of the East Las Posas Basin. We have data from Burlwood Heights Mutual Water Company that shows a increasing trend in at least one of their wells, and obviously this is of a concern as more and more wells get impacted. The ability to produce water of a quality suitable for avocado growth becomes problematic. We also have heard from County Waterworks District 1 that a number of their wells have been taken out of service, and this may be related to the declining water levels. So all three of these elements point at the continuing challenges and worsening conditions in the basin, and staff has reviewed these and concurs with these findings. In terms of expediting the basin planning process, there's been a lot of discussion about this at the last several board meetings. I think you're aware of most of these changes. I'll just run through them really quick. Agency staff has taken a more active role in the planning process. I have been directed by my bosses to operate in more of a facilitator role, and I've taken that role with the group. We've developed the aggressive schedule that we talked about under item 2. We're tracking along that schedule so far. The members of the Las Posas Users Group have expressed a commitment to the plan schedule. They've expressed a commitment to meeting longer. We've extended the meetings by a half an hour. They've also expressed a commitment to meeting more frequently. We've gone from monthly to every 2 weeks, and we will do that until further notice. And again, item 2, I think, summarized the progress so far in terms of staying on schedule. So, presuming for a moment that it would be the board's pleasure to extend the emergency ordinance, the question of how long is still out there. And when I brought this issue before the users group, originally my recommendation in accordance with our schedule was to request an extension through the end of the year to get us through the process of finalizing the plan and having the board adopt the plan. Now, we've also assumed a two-step process in terms of folding this plan into the agency's policies. The first step is adoption of the plan. The second step would be to make any appropriate changes to the agency's ordinance code. Now, it may not have to happen that way. I don't think anybody's really sure whether this is a two-step or one-step process. For the sake of argument, this is what we assumed. And in assuming a two-step process, we also assumed that the emergency ordinance would go through the end of 2011. Then there would be another final extension at the end of this year to cover the period of time necessary to update the ordinance code if that's what needs to happen. Now, the users group felt that we shouldn't be putting forward a recommendation that ties your hands. And what I mean by that is we have to notice this ordinance publicly, and the way we write our recommendation can force you into a situation where you can only adopt it for a certain length. So we've noticed this in a manner and written this in a manner where it can be adopted for any length of time. And what the users group felt was they wanted the board to have the discretion to say how much time do we need to review the plan and adopt it. Our schedule assumes 3 months for that process, but they felt that you may decide you need more time. So that's the reason for leaving the date open-ended. Now, having said that, from staff's perspective, we feel that things are moving along well. We have an aggressive schedule laid out here, but there's some difficult work ahead, and it might be a little presumptuous at this point to assume that the plan will follow exactly along this schedule and that we would be in a position to be doing these things at the end of the year and the beginning of next year. So our recommendation is just to extend it through the end of the year. And that also makes a lot of sense if you think about how our semi-annual statements work. They go out and we get them in June and at the beginning of the year. So really this emergency ordinance D can really only operate on a year-by-year basis based on how our reporting works, or a 6-month by 6-month basis. So extending it to March or April at this point in time, although it's possible, doesn't necessarily make perfect sense with how our reporting goes. So our recommendation is to extend it through the end of the year, and if further extensions are needed, that they should be based on demonstrated progress on the basin plan at the time that the request is made. That's all I have.
Any questions? Did a good job
Yeah.
of not getting, oh.
Just a combination for both of you. extending emergencies can become problematic as we're going forward. You said, you've now read into the record, we would only extend it if we're making progress on the plan. And my question for County Council and for you is, shouldn't it be that we extend the emergency because the emergency conditions are, that should be the basis for our extending of the emergency?
Yes, the emergency conditions are the basis for the ordinance, but the reason for it to be put in place is to allow time for the plan to be developed. So we sort of work in conjunction.
So we can tie part of the rationale for extending it to progress being made on the plan.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Any other questions? No?
Madam Chairman, I move that we accept staff's recommendation.
Why don't we see if there's anybody who wants to speak to us on
All right.
this?
Yes, and as a reminder, this is a public hearing item.
Yeah. Okay.
I also have some thoughts on what the recommendation should be in terms of how we've done the item. So I have some ideas on that.
Okay, is there anybody who'd like to speak to us on this item? That's a first. Okay. Okay, you had some comments.
In terms of your motion, you'll notice that the item we put in the agenda package is a red line strikeout. So the first suggestion is that part of your motion state that you're accepting those red line changes so that we can update this accordingly. And the second piece of the recommendation is, of course, that you'll need to state your desired expiration date since there's blanks in what's in the agenda package.
Dr. Kelly.
Madam Chairman, I move that we accept the red line changes on the example emergency ordinance D revision number 34, and that we additionally extend the expiration date to December 31, 2011. Thank you.
Okay, is there a second? I'll second. There's a motion and a second. Is there discussion?
Yeah, that's through December 1, 2011, through that day, right? Yeah, okay. I just would like to speak to the motion, and that is, so far we're doing fine. Nobody seems to be challenging this, but I think the message has to be to the people working on this: you got to make progress. You got to get going on this thing. It only takes one person to say, "Hey, this thing is dragging, and we're not getting after it." So, I just hope that that we would also be sending the message, and we did last time when we requested these things. Yes. That we really have to have progress. People have to make the hard decisions, and the other reason why people have to make the hard decisions is the basin is deteriorating. It's just the decisions get harder the more deteriorated the basin gets. So, I hope we can send that message to everybody.
I just would like to add, if you look at under item 2, you look at the users list sign-in sheet, where we were a year or two ago, it was very skinny. I mean, you could put 4 or 5 people on there. Look at the growth now. So there's no question the stakeholders, Steve, are very active in this process. So I just want to put that on the record.
Can you please formally close the
Pardon?
hearing
Yeah.
prior to motion?
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, that's right. I'll close the public hearing, and now I'll take your motion.
Third time's a charm. Madam Chairman, I move that we accept the red line changes in the example given emergency ordinance D revision 34, and that we extend the expiration date to December 31, 2011.
And I'll second that.
Okay. We've had our discussion, but is there any more discussion? Okay, could we have a roll call?
Chair Craven?
Yes.
Director Nauman?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Director Kelly?
Yes.
Okay, motion
Thank you.
carries. Thank you. Item 5, the John K. Flynn Groundwater Stewardship Award.
Thank you. Chair Craven, board members, for the record, Gerhard Hubner, Watershed Protection District. I have a very short presentation, 2 slides, but I'll just jump into it because I don't see it coming up. As you're aware, this annual award we initiated in 2003 with an individual or entity that contributed the most in protecting groundwater, enhancing water quality, or assisting the GMA in efforts to manage its water resources. We created the guidelines with the first award. The requests for nominations were actually sent out with our January semi-annual statements. We did not receive any nominations. We do intend to announce the winner at the next Association of Water Agencies Symposium on April 21st, 2011. So I'll just jump to our recommendation. We have this in front of you each year. A little bit of awkwardness with the election, wanting to keep it to a certain degree secret because we want to announce it at the symposium. So our recommendation, as we did last year, is that you select and convene a 2-member agency board member ad hoc committee via teleconference at your pleasure or convenience to consider nominees and select award recipient.
Okay. Lynn wasn't here last year for this selection of a committee either, if I remember correctly.
He seems to skate out on that.
Yeah.
And since he's not here, he might be a good nominee.
I think so. No? I think you're outnumbered on that. I see a lot of people nodding their heads.
I know Lynn long enough that he would not appreciate that process.
Going to ask him, are we?
I don't want to be the one to share it with him.
I think Director Nauman has probably nominated himself then. Probably that would be the... So I would suggest perhaps Director Nauman and Director Borchard, they make a good pair.
Are you the two who did it last year?
I can tell you who last year's were, if you're interested.
Who was the committee last year?
It was Lynn Mulhart and David Schwabar.
Okay.
We have a tradition of an alternate and a regular.
I'd be willing to serve.
I think we should share and put Lynn back in that process. So that's I don't think he would object to, honestly. So
You've changed your mind.
Self-interest certainly does wonders for your logic, doesn't it?
Well, now we have
the pleasure of the chair.
we now have 3 nominees.
I think they're requesting 2.
I know.
So,
But
well, I'd be willing to be one of them.
okay.
I'll do it.
Okay. So we have our committee.
Excellent. And we'll have Miranda contact you with a time for our teleconference if that works for you. Thank you.
Thank the nominees for accepting.
Yes. Okay, number 6, adjustment to extraction allocations in accordance with Section 5.3 of the Ordinance Code. Have a staff report, please.
Good afternoon, Chair Craven and members of the board. For the record, my name is Rick Birgutz. I'll be presenting item number 6 today, adjustment to extraction allocations in accordance with Section 5.3 of the Ordinance Code. So, as you may be aware, municipal and industrial operators can obtain additional groundwater extraction allocation when land converts from agricultural to municipal and industrial use. That transaction is governed by Section 5.3 of the Ordinance Code. 2 acre-feet per acre of a historical extraction allocation may be provided. It might be more or less than the existing water use at the parcel, and 2 acre-feet is a simplifying approach to a sometimes very complex and sometimes undeterminable history of water use at a parcel. The benefit to that approach, though, is that it makes the required finding of no net detriment in Section 5.3.2 of the Ordinance Code pretty straightforward. I'm going to show you 2 slides that show this simple case, and I'll briefly discuss them. So under scenario 1, this would be agriculture, or these would be 2 farms, 2 different farmers, an urban area. This would be the municipal and industrial well up here with a historical allocation of 400 acre-feet per year. This is an agricultural well with a historical allocation of 200 or more acre-feet per year that serves the 100-acre parcel. And the other important issue is what's going on underground. In Pleasant Valley, we have a basin management objective of 20 feet above mean sea level for the water table. Currently, and actually for the last many, many years, it's been 30 or 40 feet below that basin management objective. So there's an overdraft concern in Pleasant Valley, and the agency does have basin management objectives there. Now, you could say in this approach, the applicant and the agency staff have a good handle on what the agricultural groundwater use is here at this parcel. We know the water comes from this well and it's applied on this parcel. And let me move on to the next slide. So with that good understanding, what we find is that if that agricultural land is taken out of service and we provide 2 acre-feet per acre to the M&I provider, we'll give them an additional 200 acre-feet up here, and that'll bring their annual allocation up to 600 acre-feet per year. And we've got good information that tells us that this agricultural parcel and the well is no longer pumping, and that essentially we still have the same total historical allocation in the basin, 600 acre-feet per year. That's what we had on the last one. We had 400 plus 200. They've been combined, and now we have 600 again, and there's no increase in the historical extraction allocation. So that's real straightforward, real easy to make the case that there's no net detriment. So it gets more complicated than that, though. We've had recent requests for transfers where the groundwater source for the parcel is at best uncertain. It might be undocumented. We know the parcel was farmed. We can see it. We know it was farmed, but we don't know where the water came from. It could be from an on-site well or an off-site well. It could be from a combination of wells. It could be a blend of surface water and groundwater, such as from Pleasant Valley County Water District or maybe United's pipeline. But we don't really know. And so given those uncertainties, at least 2 issues arise, and I've got them listed here, of course. The first one, it might not be practical to reduce the agricultural extraction allocation that served that land, since that allocation can't be identified. Section 5.3.3 of the ordinance does say that we are to look for that and adjust the historical allocation from the wells that used to provide water to that parcel. But sometimes those can't be located. And B, the simplifying approach may not account for other complexities, making the finding of no net detriment difficult. And I should say that's a required finding. It's in the ordinance. It's section 5.3.2. So here's a second scenario, essentially a similar block diagram, except here we have the same farm. Here's the well. But when we go over, the well's unregistered. It's unreported. They have no historical extraction allocation. And there's also no documentation on how much water was pumped from that well. So it's a little bit more complicated. It's getting harder to show the case of no net detriment. Now, there are 2 outcomes, at least 2 outcomes to these, and we get these applications from time to time. One outcome is what I call automatic approval. The applicant submits the request. They say, you know, your ordinance says we get 2, give us 2. And following that logic, though, we're missing some what I think is important information about whether or not the extractions in the basin are going to be increased with that transaction. In this case, look at the balance sheet. Assuming we approve it, there's the existing 400 for the M&I use. We're unable to quantify the use from the well or the groundwater use on the parcel. But we provide 200 acre-feet new, and we give them 600. So what you have in this case is you have a net increase in the historical extraction allocation in the overdrafted basin and an unquantified change in the prior agricultural extractions. So there's a potential net detriment here. A second path that this transaction could take is more work is done to show that there isn't a net detriment with it. And what would happen in this case is additional work would be done, but it wouldn't be approved automatically. The net detriment analysis could include an applicant doing additional due diligence that shows they have a good understanding of the past groundwater use on the parcel to try and get us closer to where we are with the first example I showed you that's more straightforward. And in this transaction, we would still grant the 600 acre feet, but we do so with a demonstration of no net detriment being made, but we do so knowing that we're authorizing additional historic allocation in the basin where the basin management objectives are not being met. So it comes down to no net detriment. Really, this is an issue about the aquifer and the water levels in the aquifer, the fact that basin management objectives aren't being met, and that it's hard to quantify these changes. A little bit about the ordinance code. I've mentioned this already. Section 5.3, right up front, it says transfers are authorized providing they result in no net detriment. There's some guidance in the ordinance code about it. It talks about including location of wells and groundwater basin condition, and as I've described, we have basin management objectives in Pleasant Valley that aren't being met. And then 5.3.3 says when the irrigated agricultural land changes to M&I use, a basic extraction allocation of 2 acre feet shall be transferred. So one of the things that we've struggled with is the fact that on one hand, section 5.33 says transfer it. On the other hand, 5.3.2 says it's authorized if there's a showing of no net detriment. A little bit more about the detail. Section 5.33 states that allocation shall be transferred. It's an imperative. And forgive me, this is a little redundant. I got ahead of myself on that last slide. And then 5.3.2 states the transfer is subject to the no net detriment finding. So it's somewhat inconsistent in its terminology regarding the type of allocation being transferred as well, but traditionally staff provides a 2 acre foot per acre historical extraction allocation. So is this a big deal or a small issue? Let me try and provide some context to you. Future ag development or future ag to M&I development is listed in the 2020 general plans and the city urban growth boundaries. The city of Camarillo will convert 375 acres to municipal industrial use by 2020. And at 2 acre feet per acre, that's about 750 acre feet of potential new historical allocation. And the city of Oxnard will convert about 1,600 acres by 2020. And at 2 acre feet, that's about 3,300 acre feet. So these are big numbers. These are significant. And certainly where overdraft is a concern, staff feels we need to look at these carefully. So we will be seeing additional requests as the years roll forward. We have an idea of the magnitude. It's about 4,000 acre feet. We haven't received the requests yet, and this might be a good point to mention to you that the GMA does not collect a lot of detailed information on where the water is being used on the parcels. We just don't. We track extractions from the wells, and when these applications come in, many times we ask the applicant, please study it. Do you have your arms around where the water was coming for that parcel? Unfortunately, we're not able to help them directly in a lot of these cases. The exceptions would be when irrigation efficiency is filed on those parcels. And in those cases, parcel maps are provided. They indicate the water use in the well. And there we have the data to bracket the groundwater use on that parcel. Again, the histories regarding groundwater use are complicated, and they might be undetermined as we've seen in other cases. So this is looking forward. We're going to continue to see these complicated issues, and we feel the simplifying approach may not be adequate in all cases to make the finding of no net detriment. Here's some specific examples. There's 3 up here. One was a Laro development / City of Camarillo. There was a 44 acre parcel that was farmed, and it's now part of the Springville development. There was a well on it. It was destroyed. The well was operating under the radar, as we say sometimes. It had no historical extraction allocation. There was no reporting from the well. So we don't know how much water from that well provided water to that parcel. No historical allocation. And to complicate things a little bit further, in recent years, the city of Camarillo actually provided water for agriculture to that parcel. This one was fairly complicated. We asked the City of Camarillo to go back and study it some more and try and make the case that that transaction wouldn't result in a net detriment. We haven't heard back from them yet. A second example with the City of Camarillo, this one for a 150-acre parcel. There are 6 wells within that parcel. 3 of them were actually destroyed before the base period. 1 can't be found. 1 is operating under the radar, we just found out. And 1 was destroyed in 2010. None of them have a historical extraction allocation. We don't have extraction data on any of them. Since 2002, the Pleasant Valley County Water District has been supplying those parcels as well. So a little bit of a complicating factor there. And we've also talked with the City of Camarillo about this and told them we'd like to see more work showing that it's not a net detriment. City of Ventura, this is a small one, 10-acre parcel, and until recently, they were not able to determine where the water came from for the parcel. We asked them to go back and take a look, and they figured it out. So that will be a fairly easy transaction for us to move forward. The ordinance requires, section 5.3.3.1 through 3 requires that the applicant and the agency sort of get their arms around where the water was coming that served these parcels. They have some criteria about how to prorate it, and the City of Ventura has found that information out. So, in conclusion, really the key issue here is the aquifer conditions, and our technical understanding of the aquifer conditions is key. How that transfer affects the aquifer conditions is really important. There are a number of other issues related to the ordinance code, but at the end of the day, it's about the aquifer and whether or not the transfer is going to make the overdraft worse. In Pleasant Valley Basin, or in Pleasant Valley, the basin management objectives have not been met for an awful long time. I posed a threshold question in the board letter. Should the agency approve the transfer of new historical allocation to M&I providers under section 5.3.3 when there is no clear reduction in an agricultural groundwater extraction? The simplifying approach isn't always able to support the finding of no net detriment. Some of these transactions, they appear or they will create new allocation in overdrafted basins. And we're seeking your direction on how to process these requests. For these more complicated ones, we don't recommend approval of them until we get more information about no net detriment. The ordinance requires that that case be made, and we're looking for more information in that regard. As I said, we're looking for your direction. It could include a clarifying resolution detailing the kinds of information needed to make the no net detriment finding. It could include an ordinance update to address the issue. It could include whatever your board sees fit in terms of providing us direction. And that concludes my presentation.
Any questions? Is there anyone who'd like to speak to us on this?
My name is Tom Smith. I'm with the City of Camarillo. First off, I'd like to clarify a couple items that Mr. Vergoots brought up. The fact that the City of Camarillo really hasn't, it doesn't sound like the city has been really diligent in trying to get this transfer of allocation. I would like to mention that we have actually provided the GMA with 2 letters and an application, and we've been diligently trying to meet the needs of the GMA, and we are working very closely with them. The second thing I'd like to mention too also is that I think it really boils down to what is the true definition of no net detriment, and that's what we've been trying to work with the GMA on and try to provide them with the information that they're looking for. And I'd also like to just share with you for a minute why we feel that the city's application for the allocation transfer is not a net detriment to or not a detriment to the basin. First off, M&I users typically or historically have always used less water than the ag community. I don't want to go into the specifics, and we'll go into the specifics at some point in the future when we come before your board with our application, or to support our application, I should say. And the other thing I want to mention too is that the water delivered to the land that was previously being served to by Pleasant Valley County Water District is now actually available to somebody else, and typically, and in this case, it's most likely somebody that is to the south of this property, which in this property is near the Camarillo Airport and the 101 freeway. That water is now being provided to somebody else, so they won't have to pump that water, which is in the area that was earlier talked about and being in a saline area. Might reduce some of the seawater intrusion in that area as well. I'd also like to mention that the staff report talks about some future requests by the city of Camarillo. I really wasn't clear if the 750 acre feet to 1,000 acre feet was over and above the 300 acre feet that we're asking for now, but if it is over and above, it might be a little on the high side. I also mentioned earlier that we will be presenting more information to your board, and we'll also work very closely with GMA staff to answer all of their questions, and hopefully we believe we can prove that there is no net detriment to the basin with regard to our request for the transfer. So thank you for your time.
Okay, now it's my impression today we're not talking any specific pieces of property. We're just talking in general as to how we're going to deal with these things in the future. So if there is any request that's going to be coming in the future, you'll have to deal with them individually.
Right. And I understand that, but today, my point today was just to, as I mentioned, clarify some of Mr. Margutz's comments and let you know that we do have applications. We have an application in, and we will certainly address that in some detail in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next.
Bob Saperstein for City of Oxnard. Thank you, board members. And again, the city is only here to talk about this provision in the ordinance generally. We have nothing, unfortunately, have nothing presented to the GMA because there really aren't any ag TAM&I transfers that are in the queue, or at least immediately. I rewind way back on these provisions of the ordinance and have to accept responsibility. Drafting an ordinance by committee is the wrong way to do it, and here's an example of why it's the wrong way to do it. I absolutely agree with staff that there are internal inconsistencies that make it difficult if you just stand back and read the words in figuring out what do we mean? What did the drafters of this section 5.3 mean when we develop the whole set of criteria of potential transfers of allocation, of which this ag TAM&I transfer is only one example. In section 5.3.3, this is the operative section for the ag TAM&I transfers. The first sentence is really the key provision. It's when irrigated agricultural lands change to M&I use. And we use that terminology, and actually its genesis comes from different, more specific language that was from the original Ordinance 5, that was the genesis of our now new Ordinance 8.1, whatever it is. That was even more carefully crafted, and it was prime irrigated agricultural lands that had a specific definition. The whole idea of it was when irrigated agricultural lands transition to M&I, it's presumptively a net benefit to the basin. No net detriment, presumptively a net benefit, because very hard to find any irrigated agricultural lands that are using less than 2 acre foot per acre. So just converting that and giving over to the M&I folks an original 2 acre foot per acre historic allocation, which in fact is really only 1.5 acre foot per acre current allocation now, it is a net benefit to the basin. It's a give back. Any irrigated agricultural land that gets converted and the M&I user gets 1.5 acre foot per acre, it's a net benefit to the basin.
Regardless of where the water comes from?
Regardless of where the water comes from.
Why is that?
Typically for agricultural lands, it's either coming from a mutual water company, a groundwater well, surface water from United, or some mixture of water from Pleasant Valley that's all local water, and it's being used at greater than 2 acre-foot per acre. You're taking out of service that agricultural demand and planting houses. The demand
Does that necessarily benefit the aquifer?
Well, so the M&I user
water?
can only use 1.5 acre-foot per acre groundwater. So there's a give back on groundwater, and almost every M&I user, and for example, for the city of Oxnard, we take a mixture of imported water and local groundwater to meet our demands. We can only use 1.5 acre-foot per acre groundwater. So we're giving back groundwater, we have to make it up from somewhere else.
But if the irrigated acreage was surface water,
yes,
and the M&I is taking groundwater, how is that a net benefit?
that surface water is otherwise displacing the groundwater use. So it's really all one big bathtub. What you've eliminated is...
You're just saying, oh, it's all together.
Yeah.
I need to be specific.
Yes,
how
I understand.
is it all one big bathtub?
So and let's use maybe Pleasant Valley County Water Districts as the most complex example. And I'll even come back to the complexity and why it is we ended up with this should be automatic approach. But Pleasant Valley County Water District takes a mixture of surface water from United, their own groundwater wells, surface water from Canal Creek, and their universe is defined. All of their customers get that mix of water supplies. If you remove from their demand mix a 100-acre parcel that used 3 acre-foot per acre of all of the water supplies that Pleasant Valley have, you've removed from demand 300 acre-feet of water from their class of customers. Now the city steps in, or the urban water purveyor steps in, can only supply at most 150 acre-feet of groundwater. Pleasant Valley has eliminated 300 acre-feet of overall demand on its system that allows it to either leave water in the forebay, take less groundwater from its wells, and use more surface water to supply its customers. Somehow 300 acre-feet of demand is relieved from Pleasant Valley, and that surface water stays in the system somewhere, either to meet other demands or stays in the forebay. The urban water purveyor is only using at most half of it, 150 acre-feet per acre groundwater, and infilling the rest of its demand with some other waters.
And are we certain Pleasant Valley would have a net decrease of 300 acre-feet of their usage, or couldn't Pleasant Valley use that 300 acre-feet for some other usage?
Yes, it could use that 300 acre-feet for some other use if it accepted a new customer, if the mix of its uses changed within its service area. Yet another tenet of this agency is we will never get in under the bed sheets of any particular water purveyor and say you can or cannot change the uses of your mix. You would never say to Pleasant Valley, you can't accept new customers. They have done it.
But that's not the argument. We're not asking them for the right to change what they're doing. We're asking whether we are assured that there's going to be a net benefit to the basin, and how can we be assured of that as long as they have the ability to increase, to take on a new customer with that 300, then it's not a savings to the aquifer any longer.
There is no absolute assurance. So
I think what he was trying to explain was why the assumption that this was set up on originally. And you're questioning.
Sure, I'm trying to question the rationale of the assumption to make sure that it's right. I think that's appropriate.
And there are ways to test it where there are always exceptions to the underlying assumption. I'll stop. There's one other basis of...
You need to be able to continue with what you were going to say before this questioning started, but Jeff had something he wanted to insert on this particular part of the discussion.
Yes, our issue is with the assumptions. Rob makes good points, and it's consistent with what we heard when we talked to the people who've been around the basin historically. But things have changed dramatically, and Pleasant Valley is a great case in point. They just took into their customer base somebody who had really knocked hard on the aquifer. I think we're all familiar with them. And this 300 acre-feet may be used to supply that person, which I think we would argue is a net detriment to the basin. And it's hard for us, not knowing where the water gets used or how to really ferret that out. And Our question is, how hard do we push on the applicants to kind of ferret that information out, if at all, based on the previous discussions with the constituency?
And if, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But if I could address that point. This discussion, this exact discussion came up in talking about how do we do this in a way that's fair to the aquifer system, fair to the lands that are transitioning, doesn't create too heavy a burden. And because what we had found, exactly what Rick mentioned, there is a forensic impossibility, so one piece of the puzzle, forensic impossibility to go back to 1985 to 1989 for some lands and figure out what the heck was going on. Where was the water coming from, from which wells, how much water was being used. So impossibility in some cases. Number one was to even go back and answer some of the very legitimate questions. How do we account for the water that went into historical allocation for somebody if the land was irrigated in the base period? But more importantly, for agricultural lands, base period is almost meaningless when you're talking about lands transitioning in the year 2012, 2013, because they can rely on efficiency. Lands that were not irrigated during the base period can immediately start using 5 acre-foot per acre to grow row crops, hoops, raspberries, whatever it might be, 4 acre-foot per acre without any historical allocation, new demand on the basin. And if you went back and just looked at irrigated agricultural land, you'd say if you converted that to 1.5 acre-foot per acre, you're saving water to the basin. So what we did way back when, this is the late 90s, another iteration in the early 2000s, what Oxnard did in particular was look at its entire sphere of influence and did kind of the exercise that Rick did in saying, what if all of those lands convert? We analyzed what their current use was, and the study was done in the late 1990s, looked at the entire sphere of influence, looked at the agricultural uses that were being made of those lands at the time, and what if automatically, magically, all of those lands converted at 2 acre-foot per acre and were served by the city. There was a net benefit to the basin. Water given back to the basin. That doesn't answer your question, Director Bennett, what if that mix of water, we can't control whether the entities that were supplying those lands maybe go somewhere else and use that water. Impossible to control that and answer that question. What the city did to help lay the framework for this provision in the ordinance was do that analysis for its entire sphere of influence, and it showed a net benefit to the basin. Water given back to the basin if the city took over complete responsibility, getting 1.5 acre-foot per acre net now and serving those lands. If I can talk about the inconsistency in the ordinance as well, I'm sorry to go on at such length. This is, again, sort of drafting by committee. Section 5.3.2, as Rick correctly points out, says overarching provision in this ordinance is no net detriment. When you look at section 5.3, this section on transfers from Ag to M&I, it never says apply no net detriment consideration when you do this Ag to M&I. But every other section, 5.3.4, when you're transferring between M&I extraction facilities, must provide a no net detriment. Says it, repeats the requirement again. Section 5.3.5, transfer of allocation, repeats that requirement again. Section 5.3.6 and 5.3.7 deal with the mechanism. We purposely left that out of 5.3.3, this section that deals with Ag to M&I transfer, because it's presumed. Irrigated agricultural land transferring to M&I does give back water to the basin, notwithstanding your good question about if you really follow the water, how do you guarantee it? That's an unanswerable question. I shouldn't say unanswerable. The policing mechanism is not in place to do that. And so to be fair, because the M&I folks do not have the ability to increase their usage of groundwater based on efficiency, this was deemed to be an appropriate method that gives back some and treats the M&I folks fairly without them having to spend an extraordinary amount of time and energy dealing with the GMA database when those answers just aren't there. The unfortunate method in which the GMA was created, its database didn't link water use to property. It only linked water use to wells. And that pattern of use changes irrigation season by irrigation season, if not more frequently than that, where water can get spread around on irrigated agricultural lands.
Okay.
Thank you.
You just made up for the last 3 meetings.
I
and you
did,
didn't
and I
speak.
apologize at the outset. And Lynn's not here to make fun of me. That's not even.
No, but Rob, if you would, at the same time, looking back when we were doing this, there was a big discussion. What number should it be? Should it be 2.5? Should it be 1.5? Should it be 2? So the process was well defined and argued about, and it was by committee with the idea, like Rob said, we have this much out there. When we change it over, we're going to shrink it down so that we know that we should have over the whole basin at that time. And the concept still falls in place, that you're not taking more than what was there before.
And in fact, when it was initially drafted in late 1990s, it really was 2 acre-foot per acre. We weren't, the M&I folks weren't smart enough to recognize that was going to be ratcheted down to 1.5 acre-foot per acre.
Well, that's why we took it. You said 1.5. We said sold.
That's right, and it, you know, it made sense. We were given historical allocation despite the discomfort. We recognize historical allocation gets ratcheted down, so we're not now getting 2 acre-foot per acre. If there are future cram downs on historic allocation, it'll be less. If it changes, it'll be different.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Bachman? Oh, go ahead.
Susan Mulligan, Cayugas, very briefly to pick up on and maybe elaborate on one of the points that Rob made. There's an inherent benefit that needs to be looked at aside from the historical use of water on a parcel. Any parcel that moves from a kind of unquantified efficiency pumping basis to a quantified basis is a benefit. That parcel that may be using surface water today could go in tomorrow, operate a well, and operate on efficiency. So it's a risk as long as it's continued to be designated ag. So looking at historical may be part of it, but it could always go to using groundwater tomorrow. So I think that ought to be part of the consideration and the calculation. Did that make sense?
Okay. Anybody else?
Commissioner Craven, Board, Brook Pearl. A couple of questions. In the beginning of your staff report, first paragraph, I'd like a definition, possibly you can explain. The last sentence in the first paragraph, it says every acre of agricultural land. Can you define that? We've been talking about on page 2 of 4, we're talking about irrigated agricultural land. Are we talking about one and the same? I don't believe we are. If we use paragraph 1, you're going to allow general transfers allowed the increase of the city's historical extraction allocation to the rate of 2 acre-feet per acre for every acre of agricultural land. Are we talking about open pasture? Are we talking about rangeland? Are we talking about abandoned land? Are we talking about riverbed? There's no definition. I could see somebody sliding in under that. With respect to the 2 acre feet, I've heard an interesting discussion of how the 2 acre feet was arrived at, so I don't have a fair question on that. But one gentleman asked a question, and I'd take his words specifically, the true definition. What are we using as a true definition of a well? An abandoned well? A well in a low aquifer that cannot provide water that's acceptable to the crops that are trying to be grazed? What are we using as a true definition of agriculture or farmland, as farmland is used in your term? There's quite a bit of farmland. There are some farms that are used as tax write-offs. With respect to the quality of water and the degradation, some crops, it was mentioned by someone earlier, I believe it was a different item, avocado production with the quality of water would not be acceptable with the quality of water that was being pumped. There are some crops that will not be acceptable with the quality of water available. And then it gets into a couple of examples that were used. And we did hammer apparently pretty good on the city of Camarillo here, but when this first went into place, I recall that being told that the Boy Scouts were used to go and search out the wells. How did these various wells slip through the cracks? And what was the punishment for the individuals that did not? And I believe I've heard today that there's even one just recently found that was an operation that hadn't been reported. How is this able to slip through the cracks? And how do you prevent this from happening again, or how do you impose a sanction on this individual that somebody else who's slipping through the cracks decides to come forward? Because the issues that come up with this issue of the water and how you're going to adjudicate it, when you are going to give the cities the opportunity to transfer agricultural water to M&I, we have examples in the state of Nevada. Las Vegas is buying farmland, and the farmland is giving them the rights to the wells, to the rights to water. If we have communities annex farmland, and the farmland has not been used with the requirements historically of the water that is being claimed is coming from those farmlands, are we giving them extra ability to take water? And there was another question. There was a well mentioned that was destroyed. I'd be interested to know why that particular well was destroyed several years later. That's on page 3 of 4 of the first paragraph. Again, we're talking about Camarillo. And one other thing, the state of Oregon. It has been historical in state that if the farms do not use the water that is allocated to the property, the water goes with the property, with the land. If the farms don't use the water, the state retains the water rights. If you're only using half of your allocated water, and you only use half, the other half goes to the state and you lose your rights. I hope you can answer some of those questions. But the definition is definitely, it appears you have apples and oranges on your definitions. Thank you for having me speak.
Okay. Anybody else like to talk to us?
If I could, just a moment. Yeah, Tom Smith and I have been working on this issue. So, Tom, I'm sorry if I felt like I beat up on you a little bit. But, yeah, we've had some good discussions about it. And Tom's right. One of the things that we struggle with is, what is the definition of net detriment? His other question about the 750, that does include the recent request. And one of the things that Mr. Saperstein brought up, it's a point we've heard before that, you know, somebody could sink a well and file under irrigation efficiency and use a lot of water. And that is, I'm not exactly sure how to handle that issue, because that's a prospective thing looking forward in terms of what could happen on the parcel, not on the historical water use. So that's something that's come up from time to time. And also with Susan Mulligan, she's right, and we have done this. We're not just looking at whether or not there's a historical allocation attached to the land. It's about the water. At the end of the day, it's about the water. Whether there was a historical extraction allocation or not is important to know, but we're looking at all the water that's come out of the land. So I just wanted to respond to those. Thank you.
Okay.
Could I ask a question?
Certainly.
The gentleman who stood up before Rick here asked a question I think was apropos. It's not really pertinent to this discussion, but wells were discovered that slid under the radar, and he asked the question, what's going to be done about that? We've pretty vigorously pursued others who have done the same thing. Is that underway as well?
Absolutely. Yep.
Very good.
We're all over them.
Okay. I think for once, I'm sorry that Lynn isn't here to hear what he has to say on this. He'd have taken up till 4 o'clock. May as well beat up on Lynn since he's not here. Are there any other questions now that we've...
Rick, can you clarify, and Jeff, what direction are you really looking for here? So we're not too broad stroke, but get some specifics, please.
Yes, let me take a shot at Rick. I have had discussions with Chair Mulhart, and his observations are very similar to Rob's observations in that when this was originally discussed, macrocosmically, it was thought that it was clear that there would be a net benefit to the aquifer. under the recent circumstances, and the one particular, the example we described, we say it's probably not as clear as that anymore. And we are, one of the things you should be aware of is that Chair Mohart did tell me that this provision in the ordinance was taken by M&I to be their equivalent of ag's irrigation efficiency, and that's the way it had been practiced. And perhaps that was because the document that was produced by Oxnard showed that in the macrocosm and their sphere of influence, they were okay. And certainly that would be sort of a document that we'd look for to demonstrate no detriment. I don't know how difficult that sort of thing would be for Camarillo to produce. And I was under the impression that in most cases, this is an isolated case where the city's been supplying water for a long time, and we don't know that if there was ever an historical allocation. And we were bringing it to your board's attention, should this, because it seemed like a big number, up to maybe 1,000 acre-feet in this particular case, which would seem to be a detriment to the aquifer. So we wanted to know if your board wanted to, we accepted based on what we heard historically that was the way the board had practiced this. And our question to your board is, do you want to keep practicing it that way, or do we want to up the stakes a little bit, I guess? And that in the context of the presentations you've received on the expansion of use that's inherent in irrigation efficiency, the expansion of use that's inherent in the credit usage. This represents an expansion of use, and it's our information at this time that the aquifer in general is under a lot of stress, and in very particular areas under a great deal of stress. So it's just in keeping with sort of the evolution, I suppose, of the way your board directs staff to operate, and that's why we're presenting it.
I do have two questions.
Okay.
My questions are hypothetical questions, and I'll throw them out there for anybody, Rob, to answer, staff to answer, or maybe a number of people to answer. But my two questions are this. If we were presented with evidence that, I'm going to use Pleasant Valley as the example. If we were presented with evidence that Pleasant Valley intended to take the 300 acre-feet that they were no longer going to, that they were no longer going to be supplying to this ag operation, and they were going to supply it to a greenhouse that was going to intensively use that water there. Would we say this still automatically goes through? In other words, where there is clear demonstration that it's not an uncertainty, it's not impossible to track. We actually have them stating that's our intention. I don't think we would say this is not a net. We have if we have an aquifer that is, like we've heard, under stress, not meeting our goals, it's in an overdraft. If you had clear evidence that it was not going to be used as a reduction, I think you'd say there's not the net benefit. So that's one question that I have, and then the second question that I have is when you have the whole Fox Canyon aquifer under threat, and we have concerns about sort of how much it can handle, where should the burden of proof be? Should the burden of proof be on somebody to prove that it is, a detriment? Or should the burden of proof be on somebody that, hey, look, this is clear. They were pumping this amount out of the ground, irrigating this field with it. They're going to stop pumping this out of the ground right here, and less of that is going to be allocated to somebody else. That's a clear, easy burden of proof. What we have is, look at the number of times we've had. We've had Camarillo come up and say it's a challenge. They're making good faith efforts, but it's a challenge for them to try to track this down. We've had Rob, in answer to two questions where we got to the stick point, it was, well, you can't make that a rule because it's impossible to ever get that information. And I guess if it's impossible to get the information, my second question is, where should the burden of proof be? And I think that given the stresses that we have, I'd like to hear an answer as to why the burden of proof should be different, because my initial assumption is the burden of proof ought to be on the person that wants to make this change, that it's not a net benefit. I have some other comments about that, but those are two questions I'd love to have anybody try a stab at, because they're the essential questions in my mind as I'm trying to formulate my position on this.
Well, I have a, Rob, you going to discuss
He's
that?
going to try to take a stab.
Okay, I have a couple of comments. I think what you need, there's a couple of viewpoints, whether you're ag business or a city or an industrial group, you got to have plans. So like Rob mentioned several meetings ago, whether we change the ordinance or we change plans, as long as everybody understands the rules so there's no surprises, people can operate. And I think one comment, Steve, is you can take a look at 40,000 feet up, and the closer you get down, you get different viewpoints. So it's how far down? Do you want to be at 100-foot level? Do you want to be at a 20,000-foot level? You got to figure out what elevation you want to really capitalize on. And from an ag business, you've got a cropping plan, and those cropping plans back from 1990 to 2000 have changed. You have more raspberries, you have strawberry changes, you have a nursery that came into town that's using an asset that's very valuable. So it's trying to define that area, what you need to do. But going back to what Rob and some of us did back was the idea, to repeat, was to, when the cities took over a piece of property, to not let them use more water or the same water, but to have less usage. And for Pleasant Valley, it's like a pipeline. It's like having a household. When you have family come into town, they're nice to see and they're nice to leave when they come. But at the same time, you're using more water when everybody's in the house. So you have a household on the street that maybe have 10 people because it's the holidays. You're going to have more water usage. So you've got, I don't want to take it so far down that the city of Oxnard or Camarillo has to say, okay, you get so much water per house, because that doesn't always work. I mean, there's got to be conservation and usage somehow. But it's just figure out what elevation snapshots you want to take. That's my comment.
Okay, Rob?
Rob Saperstein again for the City of Oxnard. I have to do this. It's not answering your question because I think that hypothetical is the wrong hypothetical. It really won't ever happen. We never track molecules. So there would never be an instance, never, can never say never. It's a nonsensical hypothetical to me where you pose that in exchange for conversion of ag land over here to the city of Camarillo, only if that conversion occurs will Pleasant Valley accept a new customer within its service area. It doesn't matter if it's a greenhouse, a black house, hoop house, growing corn or whatever it might grow. Pleasant Valley has an obligation to serve any customer within its boundaries unless and until it imposes a moratorium. Those engagements among its 100 or so odd customers and their water use patterns change from season to season. So if the business practices within the Pleasant Valley area suggest more folks are going to go to enclosed greenhouses like Howling or others and intensify their water use, Pleasant Valley has two choices. Impose a moratorium, so don't hook up new customers. There's a method to do that, just like City of Oxnard can impose a moratorium, or do what they currently do and say no customer will get more than 2.5 acre-foot per acre from our Pleasant Valley County Water District system. And if your needs, new customers, current customers, require more water, find it somewhere else. That transaction is completely independent from the ag to M&I conversion. Some landowner, and the ordinance is very clear, only irrigated agricultural land is entitled to the conversion. Not dormant lands, not grazed lands, not fallowed lands, irrigated agricultural lands. So embedded in it was the thought, there will be a net benefit. Only those lands are qualified for the flat 1.5 acre-foot per acre transition. So I'm dodging your question, but the hypothetical is one that doesn't really occur within the GMA.
Sure. Well, then dodge the first question. How about the second question? Where should the burden of proof be?
And again, so the should is different than what is intended in the ordinance. What was intended in the ordinance was there is no burden of proof. We will presume there is a net benefit to the basin in irrigated agricultural lands transitioning to M&I use, presumed in the current ordinance. If what you're asking is that good policy given what we need to address today and going forward, different question, but it's a much bigger question.
Wouldn't it be a more accurate presumption to say, to change the definition slightly to say ag land irrigated by a groundwater well associated with that ag land will be transferred to M&I use on a 2-acre basis. Wouldn't that be, that would give you the assurance that you were getting that savings? Would that be tighter?
Well, no, but I clearly didn't use the Pleasant Valley example well. I didn't explain myself well. Because looking just at groundwater use is a little too focused, too myopic than what all the water supplies are available within the GMA, and it's a net sum game. Net zero sum game, I guess is the proper terminology. We have surface water from United. We have surface water from Conejo Creek. Hopefully we'll have some recycled water from Oxnard. It is a finite amount of water that's available to meet the demands within the basin, and proper water management techniques should look at all of those available and controlling all of the uses, not just groundwater, not just surface water alone, all of those supplies. Because you touch groundwater over here, and people's behavior with surface water changes over there. And to not recognize the connection misses both the opportunities and the challenges. So it maybe isn't the right setting for us to have a longer conversation. It helps to draw diagrams sometimes, think about what's happening in the Forebay as opposed to what's happening in Pleasant Valley. They're absolutely connected. So you can't just look at groundwater.
And to add to that, Steve, if when you're using surface water, which we're blessed to have and use, if we didn't have that, there would be more well pumping going on. There'd be more straw sucking the water out, so the aquifer would be in a much more stressed condition than it is now. So I think you need to look at all waters to take care of the needs, like Rob's describing, because it's not just one source. Because if you're not pumping it, and we didn't have the source of the pipeline, the surface water deliveries, and possibly, hopefully in the future, the recycled water, then that puts more pressure on the aquifer. Because they're going to try to do their operations somehow.
Well, I'll stop with this. That's a true statement, but I don't know that necessarily justifies this policy. But
if I could just make a provocative statement that really goes to the point: is this policy justified any further? I suppose the M&I folks, and I mean this provocative, a little tongue-in-cheek, the M&I folks might say, we relieve the stress on at least our access to groundwater if you said nobody can pump more than 1.5 acre-foot per acre, whatever their uses are. That would be a pretty aggressive policy, but it would help move this space, probably get us to safe yield. I mean, that's how dramatic the choices need to be, but that's unworkable for agriculture.
I recognize a lot of people have lots of interest in this, and the rules of the game and all of that stuff, and we have to consider all of that, and we also have to consider those incentives as everybody's coming up with their rationale or their logic for this, and try to come up with the right policy. I appreciate the comments.
What we're being asked to do is give staff direction on what we want them to bring back to another meeting for a decision.
Mr. Chairman, before I finish, I would defend Rob Saberstein in that he argued the point with me one day that if I imported Perrier in a truck, was that to be counted as part of it? And his answer was yes. So he's consistent in wanting to do some of the total. Slightly more, I would have Director Nauman maybe endorse me on this, but some of us with gray hair and a longer memory, it was all flood and furrow here. And so if you go back far enough, ag use was significantly, probably in excess of 4 acre-feet in flood and furrow. And we've made tremendous progress, and that's how we're doing. I see 2 acre-feet as a big improvement, and certainly 1.5. I really believe in certainty, and in my opinion, 533 should stand as is.
I would just make the comment that I appreciate Director Bennett's rational asking of the question. I think you are right to ask that question. Where is the burden of proof? And I understand Rob's point that we designed it as there's no burden of proof. I'm not sure where I fall on that, but at the same time, I think it's good we have an idea of the question. The ordinance does state that, no net detriment. We have that terminology in a lot of places in the ordinance, and I think it's a good one. It kind of solidifies what we're trying to do in this agency is allow sustainability, but have no net detriment. And hopefully, in the end, at some point, the basin management plans and things get drawn up, and we get to a point where we start actually developing some recycled water and increasing supply, and we solve the big problem.
So how would you feel, what would be your direction to staff for what to bring us next time?
I think my direction to staff personally would be to leave well enough alone at this point. It seems to me this has been hashed over for many hours by many people before us, and they arrived at a solution that seemed to be the best solution at the time, and I think I agree with that determination.
I'd like to agree with that concept with as we move on and get more information on the plan, what we're doing, nobody's underground looking what's going on under there. All we can do is do testing and find out what's going on. We saw a great presentation on the seawater intrusion in the saline waters and so forth, so there's a lot of information yet to know. I don't think this is so badly broken that it can't keep moving forward unless there's some really striking evidence, Jeff, that you really need to change something. I think the concept in the committee that I was involved with, and Rob's right, it was a committee of a lot of us sitting down trying to do all the what-ifs so it was not taken advantage of, that it made good common water sense. And I think right now it still makes good water sense and good water policy the way it sits right now.
And yet the ordinance does require them to assess if there's no net detriment, which I think kind of helps back up the concept of they're asking the applicant to demonstrate that. I think that's a step in the right direction as well.
It's a 533 one, right, Rob, that doesn't have that in there? That's correct. But I think everything else around it, Jeff, clearly states no detriment to the aquifer.
That's Rob's reading of the ordinance, and if you tell us to interpret it that way, we'll be just fine with it. It's an issue of sustainability, and we're trying to bring these little pieces of the constellation of things that hit the aquifer to your board as they arise to kind of keep you informed and get you. The wheels aren't going to fall off on this particular, this particular proposal, but it is just, from our perspective, another hit to the aquifer that our belief and training tells us is under stress.
Plus, I mean, if there's a clear, I think if you look at all the other numbers around it, where it's however you want to define non-net detriment, I think if it clearly is something that really, you need to pick your battles. Is that the battle, the one that's, hey, this is really undefined, really not clear, we don't have to have the burden of proof, but we need to understand what's going on here. Then you've got to take a real strong look instead of saying automatically. But the concept was, you have irrigated lands, and they have some water supply. And that water, they couldn't farm without it. So if there's what I'm hearing is you think there's a concern about the water supply issue. But they had to have some water out there to do, whether it's Pleasant Valley water in this example, or the city, or a well. So if it's irrigated lands, there was some water supply there. So it's changed over. The concept in theory is it should be less water used on that property moving forward.
Yeah, I think the issue is very clear, and it's exactly that. So staff is coming to us and saying, what should we do when we don't know where the water supply came from for the irrigated land? Because from staff's perspective, it's not as clear that it's a net benefit if you can't identify that it is groundwater that has been pumped. I think what I'm hearing the board saying here is we're saying staff should not consider where the water came from. I mean, I think if we say no change, what I think you're hearing us say is staff should not consider where that water came from. And the burden of proof is sort of on staff to show that there's not a net benefit here, but where it's left gray, it's going to be approved if we don't give staff any other direction. That's where I think everybody is. I think that's real clear. That's where I'm not. And I want to say that so that we're clear what we're telling staff. It means in all the gray areas where staff can't tell where the water came from, as long as it's irrigated land, it's going to be approved, it's converted over to an M&I use as the ordinance is read. As long as we all know that, I would make a different motion. So I won't support doing nothing here. I'd make a different motion, which is to identify that water came from irrigated water came from groundwater. So you know you were saving water coming from the basin when you did that. I can appreciate that a lot of people worked on this way before I got here, and I respect that opinion in terms of that's just not one that I've been able to get convinced of.
How many year look back would you have?
What's that?
How many year look back would you have?
Because they change where they get their water from.
I mean, if you go back 50 years, anything that's flat and level, like this, like Spanish Hills, probably, I remember when it was pure horses, barbed wire cuts and everything. But the fact is that anything that's on flat probably has maybe an undocumentable, but a rememberable past of being irrigated. So, you know, do you go back 50 years and say, well, 49 quit doing it or something? I doubt you'll ever find a piece of pasture somewhere on Pleasant Valley Road.
That you're certain was irrigated. That you're certain was
dry pasture.
That you're certain was irrigated 50 years ago too. You don't know whether
During
it was
the past 50 years, I think is what he's saying.
Yeah. But
I mean, the minute irrigation came, in the 1920s, you couldn't hardly drive across Oxnard Plains for the dust on dry weather. When irrigation came, it got so, you know, and then wind rose between those two things. And I don't think there was an unfarmed piece. I mean, do you have any photographs in your family stuff of property that was unused in the middle of the area? It just didn't happen. You know, we transitioned through many crops, and it was wall-to-wall something.
Well, I mean, it's sort of an irrelevant question because we're not going to go there, but I would go, you know, I don't know whether you go to the base. That would be one of the things you would ask staff to suggest. Do you go back to the base year, back when you determined the allocations? Was it irrigated
The problem that comes to me, though, in all honesty, is billable hours and where are we taking this? I mean, you know, the return on the investment. You know, we can have somebody riding down the road at 35 miles an hour in a 40-mile zone. We have to make them prove that they're not exceeding the speed limit. There are certain things that we presume as being correct, and I think that the acre and a half is a presumptible correctness.
Okay, the rules that I've always operated on is that the chair speaks last, so I'm going to take my, I'm going to cut this off right now and take my chance to speak. I had some feelings when I came in here. I've listened to what everybody said, and it appears to me that if we're going to take the ordinance one little piece at a time, one little section of 5.3 point something versus 5.3 point something else, and I don't know how many are after 5, that we need to look at the whole thing, and we've done that a couple times, and it's taken some years. This part of it has been hashed out so many times, but if we're going to talk about this, whenever it comes back, I do know we're going to have a lot of people that this affects come and talk to us and say, then you're going to have to turn around and talk about the number of new wells that can be put down for agriculture. And I'm not sure we want to go there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to spend years discussing that. It was discussed for years. We came up with a solution. So right now, all I can say is I agree that we should just leave it as it is and leave it for you to interpret. But do we need a motion for that if we're not changing anything? I think we've given direction.
Council, it's just mainly direction, correct?
Okay.
Rick, is that clear as mud?
Good question. If I could. So it sounds like we're being instructed to leave it as it is. I heard one of the directors say if it's a gray area, it goes forward for approval. Director Bennett, I heard you say that if staff is unable to show that it's clearly a detriment, it goes forward. Did I hear you correctly?
Unless staff is able to.
I do think it's appropriate. I mean, if staff is looking for direction, they're asking you a question, what do you do in a situation where there's irrigated land and staff cannot document where the irrigated water came from? I think the answer is, let that go forward. I think that's what you ought to make as a motion, so that staff has that as clear direction. Otherwise, you have exactly what he's doing. Well, I heard this and I heard that. And just make it a motion, and I think that's what staff needs to hear. That's the question that they're asking.
Well, this was advertised as something that's going to come back to us. So if we're going to do that, I think we're going to have to make our motion so that
Doesn't come back. Yeah. You don't want any change in the ordinance. You're just clarifying staff's,
we either
staff an answer to a question.
give them a clarifying resolution to be brought back or a change in the ordinance to be brought back.
If I may, what I heard your board say is essentially status quo. We won't ask any questions. It's strictly an prove them as they come in basis, because there will never be a case that I'm aware of that will be able to determine where the water comes from once it gets mixed. There can always be a case made that some molecules came from state water, some came from surface, some came from ground. So
some will be recycled in the future.
Yeah, and so de facto what I heard your board say was leave it alone and just make the transfers as the applications come in.
That's a fair summary, that's what I would say, yes.
So is that your motion?
Yes.
A second?
That was a formal motion?
Yeah, Jeff just did it better than I did.
Well, I'll second his very good formal motion.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
Does everybody understand what the motion was and the second? Okay. Let's have a roll call on this.
Chair Craven?
Yes.
Director Nauman?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
No.
Director Kelly?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Okay. Item number 7, credits SAG status report. Oh, that's coming back next month, I'm sorry. Number 8, the Administrative Policies and Business Practices Manual.
Good afternoon, Chair Craven and members of the board. For the record, Gerard Kapusik, agency staff. In the spirit of Lent, I've given up PowerPoint presentations, and to assist you from not having to undergo penance, you don't have to see it. So I will focus you on just 3 sort of high-level views of this. The board is very aware of the evolution of this. First of all, just in context, in the adoption of our previous 2 fiscal year annual work plans, the majority of your board had indicated that we should do this project, but you also told us prioritize this so other more higher priorities don't suffer, and plus the nature of these projects is you have to sort of take several edits at them. We originally anticipated coming back to your board in June of this year. We didn't quite meet that target with the first cut. It was in October. You reviewed it, you received it, and you gave us direction to put it out on the street in terms of the website. Also polish it up a little bit. The version that came to you in October had 60 pages. I'm pleased to say the one in here today has 40. So we've tried to be concise and clearer and use website links wherever possible for documents that are there anyway. We've tried to focus on what matters. Essentially, the 4 paragraphs at the bottom of page 2 of the board letter pretty well summarize the case for the manual, why it's important to have clear business practice, what it means to the agency in order to comply with your board's policy directions. And in every case, the team of Miranda Nebriga, the clerk, and Dave Pinaro, and myself who worked on this over the last 18 months were guided on, do we include something that complies with or we need to include things that comply with your statutory authority regarding the public business standards. We need to make sure that what we have in the manual meets the operations needs and requirement as your board establishes in various documents, budget, work plan, and other direction? And does the manual help agency staff facilitate collaborative and efficient and effective administration of our business? We hope you concur that we've met those tests. This is a good initial grounding. We anticipate versions coming later to address some other areas that we didn't quite capture yet, but it's always a balance point between too much and too little. Perhaps we can work a little bit more on the Goldilocks test, or at your board's direction, we can look at some other specific areas if you desire. So it's set up for your consideration and adoption today as is, as you amend it, or if you wish additional time at your discretion.
Questions? We got all our questions out of us. Okay, what are the wishes of the board? Discussion.
Has council had a chance to review this? Yes. Okay. And you put your eyes on it and checked it all out and all that stuff?
I have, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Recommendation is consider adoption of the manual. I'd move that
Okay.
we adopt the manual.
I'll second that
There's a
motion.
motion and a second to adopt the manual. I didn't hear anybody say anything that indicated they weren't going to vote for this, so I'm just going to ask. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Motion carried unanimous. Okay, executive officers report.
Just one item, Chair. Reminder that your Form 700s are due for the agency if you haven't gotten them in. Ah, there we go. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Madam Chairman, the Simmons report was on the end, and I was wondering if we could find out, perhaps from Mr. Vergoots, where are we with the proposed upgrading of the Simmons stations so that we might use the USGS stations more? I understood you had some communication from our advisors on the Simmons program at the university.
Well, what we've been doing is we've got a scope of work for our current contractor to relocate the weather stations, and we did talk at the board meeting when this issue came up about possibly purchasing new weather stations, and I don't believe that's the direction that we wanted to go, but I could be mistaken.
The impression I got from Dr. Stiles was that there were some improvements that might be needed to be done, but then we would have a reliable source unassociated with our contractor.
Let me answer that. We haven't discussed it internally yet, and we don't have any recommendations prepared for your board.
Okay.
We have had some internal discussion, but we haven't come to any final conclusion.
Do you want members of the board to come forth with requests of you, or how?
Nope. We're thrashing it, trying to decide just exactly what we should recommend to your board. I mean, if you want some early previews, it does sound like we should be doing the upgrades and eventually phasing out the stations that we have with peak. And that's the direction we're leaning, but we just don't have the specifics for it yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there a motion to receive and file reports A through H under executive officers' report?
So moved.
Motion is second. Any objection? So ordered. Okay. We're at the end of our business, so the meeting is adjourned, and it's not a record.